to get away with such an abuse of his power and violation of the law. The wrongs could not be undone, but David had to face God's justice. And in chapter 12, as we read it, we saw God executing his justice, but with compassion. We see God bringing redemption and fulfilling his purpose in the midst of human mess. That's a really important thing to hold on to, that God will redeem his purposes in the midst of human mess. And if you read his life story, you will see many instances where David had demonstrated his own love of justice. The prophet Nathan came with a story that spoke right into his heart, surely. You know, that as a young man, David had loved, cared for, and protected his sheep, protected the lambs. So when he heard this tale, he was enraged by the actions of the rich man in Nathan's account, and he prescribed his own punishment. Nathan held up the mirror and showed David what he had done, and leaving him in no doubt that there would be a price to be paid. But unlike Saul, who excused his own sin, or Adam, who blamed the woman, David immediately acknowledged, "I have sinned against the Lord." Later he wrote Psalm 51, one of the most moving of psalms, to express his remorse and his need for God's mercy and his forgiveness. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." He made no excuses, and that's what set him apart from so many other men and women. In his broken state, David accepted the consequences. He wrestled, of course, what father wouldn't, with fasting and prayer for the life of his and Bathsheba's child. But he accepted the child's death and comforted his wife, because he'd learned to trust in God's righteousness. And then after that, the God who had taken away, in his mercy and his grace, he gave them another child, Solomon, or Jedidiah, meaning loved by the Lord. David had dreamed of building the new temple in Jerusalem for God, but his hands had shed so much blood that God gave that privilege to Solomon. In his latter years, poor David, I say poor because as an old man, he would have looked back upon his life. He would have looked back on the triumphs and the tragedies and would have reflected much. And he became witness both to violence and murder within his own family. He saw his own flaws, his own faults, his lust, his abuse of power played out amongst his children. But that, you were pleased to know, is the subject of another sermon. His son Absalom took matters into his own hands and raised an army against David, his father. Yet, David must have experienced something in those days of the father heart of God, because he never stopped loving Absalom, whatever he did, and was grief-stricken when Absalom died in battle. So he mustn't he, have looked back on a life of triumph mixed with tragedy. How do we look back? How will we look back on our lives as we grow older? As I said at the start, that we can read the unvarnished truth about David should give us hope. So let's finish where we began. God is constant and faithful. He's a God of love and of mercy and also of justice. God chose David and called him. God protected him, strengthened him, used him greatly. God must have known what would happen. God put a song in David's heart, a song he could sing in all the seasons of his life. When David, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink. When David messed up, God set things straight. God's purposes were not lost. David's legacy was preserved. God gifted David and Bathsheba with Solomon and fulfilled David's legacy through him. David learned through his life to submit his ways to the Lord and trust in him. He was ever ready, instantly ready to repent of his wrongdoing and seek God's forgiveness, ready to accept God's judgment and accept it. And we too